A little girl with cancer had one wish to meet a royal guard. After 15 years of unwavering service, no one expected him to break protocol. But when he did, what followed left the entire crowd in tears. Here's what happened. The morning sun cast a gentle warmth across the grounds of Buckingham Palace, its rays catching the polished buttons of Guard James Harrison's scarlet tunic as he stood at his post. After 15 years of service, including to tour in Afghanistan, Harrison had perfected the art of standing motionless while remaining acutely aware of his surroundings. Every whispered conversation, every shuffling footstep, every subtle shift in the crowd's energy, none of it escaped his notice. It was this heightened awareness that first drew his attention to the small family making their way through the gathering tourists. The mother and father moved with the careful attention of parents guarding something precious, while between them walked a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7. Her face, though pale and drawn, carried an expression of pure wonder as she took in the magnificent sight of the palace. What caught Harrison's eye, however, wasn't just her evident excitement, it was the colorful knit beanie pulled snugly over her clearly bald head, the way her parents supported her seemingly fragile frame, and the determined brightness in her eyes that spoke of a spirit far stronger than her physical condition suggested. "Mommy, look," her voice carried across the courtyard, right despite its weakness. "He's so tall, and his uniform is so red." Her enthusiasm drew gentle smiles from nearby tourists, though Harrison noticed how those smiles often melted into looks of quiet concern as they took in her appearance. A young mother nearby bent down to answer her own daughter's whispered question. "Sweetie, sometimes people get very sick," she explained softly, her voice carrying to Harrison's trained ears. "That's why we should be extra kind." Stage 4. Harrison heard another tourist murmur to his companion, "Poor thing." The father was saying she wanted to see the royal guard before the rest of the sentence disappeared into a sympathetic shake of the head. Through it all, the little girl's eyes remained fixed on Harrison's post, her expression full of the kind of pure excitement that no illness could dim. Her parents exchanged a look over her head, a look Harrison had seen before in military hospitals, a look that spoke of love, fear, and the desperate desire to protect someone they knew they couldn't save. "Not too close now, Emily," her father cautioned gently as they drew nearer. "Remember what we talked about. The guards have very important duties." But Harrison could hear the catch in the man's voice, could see the way his hand tightened protectively around his daughter's smaller one. Emily nodded solemnly, though her eyes sparkled with barely contained joy. "I know, Daddy. They protect the Queen and the palace and hundreds of years of tradition." She pronounced the last word carefully, as if reciting a lesson she'd studied specifically for this moment. Despite her evident weakness, Emily's enthusiasm seemed to give her strength as she moved closer to Harrison's post. Her steps were small but determined, each one accompanied by the supportive hands of her parents. The morning crowd parted naturally around them, creating a small pocket of space that seemed to acknowledge the special nature of this particular visit. "She's been talking about this for weeks," her mother was explaining quietly to an elderly woman who'd asked about Emily's condition. "The doctors said," her voice dropped even lower, though Harrison's trained ears caught every word. "They said we should do it soon, while she still has the strength. It's her biggest wish." The elderly woman dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "God bless her," she whispered, watching as Emily's face lit up at the sight of Harrison's bearskin cap. Such a brave little thing. Other tourists had begun to notice the family as well. A group of Japanese visitors lowered their cameras respectfully. A tall American man in a business suit quickly wiped his eyes before pulling out his phone to show his wife pictures of his own daughters back home. Parents throughout the crowd were drawing their children close, some explaining in hushed tones about the importance of being kind to others, while others simply watched with quiet sympathy. "Look at his medals, Daddy," Emily's voice carried clearly across the courtyard, full of genuine admiration. "Do you think he got them for being brave?" Her own courage in the face of her condition made the question particularly poignant. Her father's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed his emotion. "I'm sure he did, sweetheart. Just like you're brave every day at the hospital." He squeezed her thin shoulder gently. "Remember what Dr. Thompson said about your special medal?" Emily nodded proudly. "He said I'm the bravest patient he's ever had." She touched the small pin on her jacket, clearly a token from her medical team, with the same reverence Harrison's fellow soldiers showed their combat decorations. The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the courtyard stones. Harrison maintained his ceremonial stillness, but his awareness was focused entirely on the small family making their way closer to his post. In his 15 years of service, he'd stood guard through every kind of weather, faced every type of tourist, and maintained his composure through countless attempts to break his concentration. But something about Emily's innocent excitement and obvious struggle touched a part of him that all his military training hadn't quite managed to shield. As the family drew nearer, Harrison could hear more of their quiet conversation. Emily's voice, though weakened by her condition, carried enthusiasm that seemed to lift everyone's spirits around her. "Mommy, did you know the guards have to stand still for hours and hours? That's even longer than when I have to stay still for my treatments." Her mother's reply was gentle, tinged with both pride and heartache. "That's right, sweetheart. And you're just as brave as they are." She adjusted Emily's beanie with tender care, making sure it sat comfortably on her daughter's head. A young boy nearby tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why doesn't she have any hair?" The question, asked with childlike innocence, carried clearly in the morning air. "Sometimes," the father replied softly, kneeling beside his son, "the bravest warriors fight battles we can't see. That's why we need to be extra kind and respectful." The boy nodded solemnly, then gave Emily a shy wave, which she returned with a bright smile. An older couple had stopped to speak with Emily's parents, their voices low but clear to Harrison's trained ears. "Our grandson went through the same thing last year," the woman was saying, her eyes misting over. "The strength these children show, it's remarkable. The doctors gave us 3 months," Emily's father replied, his voice barely a whisper as Emily admired the palace architecture. "But she's fighting so hard. All she wanted was to see the royal guards. She's watched every video, read every book. Harrison felt something tighten in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since carrying wounded comrades in Afghanistan. Through his perfectly maintained forward gaze, he could see Emily's reflection in the palace windows, her face glowing with excitement despite her obvious physical fragility. "Look how straight he stands, Daddy," Emily exclaimed, edging slightly closer but still maintaining a respectful distance. "Just like how Nurse Jenny tells me to sit up straight during my medicine time." Her comparison between his military bearing and her own daily battles struck a chord that resonated through Harrison's rigid posture. The crowd around them had grown quieter, as if collectively holding their breath. Parents were lifting smaller children for a better view, not of the guard this time, but of the brave little girl whose joy seemed to radiate through the courtyard. Even the usual background chatter of tourists had softened to a respectful murmur. Emily had moved closer now, her steps small but determined. "Mommy, Daddy, may I please take a picture with him?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular mix of hope and politeness that only children can truly master. "I promise I won't get too close or break any rules." Her mother glanced at her watch with barely concealed anxiety, the kind of gesture Harrison had seen too many times in hospital waiting rooms. "Of course, sweetheart. But remember what the doctor said about not tiring yourself too much." As Emily's father prepared to take the photo, she smoothed her pink dress, clearly saved for this special occasion, and adjusted her beanie with careful fingers. Harrison could see her reflection in the palace windows, the way she tried to stand as straight as possible despite the obvious effort it cost her. "Just like a real guard," she whispered to herself, attempting to mimic his posture. The effort caused her to sway slightly, her father's hand instantly reaching out to steady her. Something shifted in Harrison's chest, then, a feeling he'd last experienced in Afghanistan, when decisions between protocol and humanity had meant the difference between life and death. Through his ceremonial stillness, he could feel the weight of every regulation, every rule, every tradition that made the Queen's Guard what it was. But he could also feel something else, something that spoke of a deeper duty, a more fundamental calling that had drawn him to military service in the first place, the duty to protect, to serve, to recognize true courage when he saw it. Emily had positioned herself carefully at what she deemed a respectful distance, her smile bright despite the paleness of her face. "Daddy, do I look soldier straight?" she asked, trying to hold herself as still as possible. though her small frame trembled with the effort. Harrison could hear her breathing, slightly labored but determined. In his years of service, he'd seen countless tourists pose for photos, but never had such a simple act carried such weight. Through his peripheral vision, he caught sight of her parents' expressions, that unique mixture of pride, love, and barely contained heartbreak that only parents of critically ill children seemed to master. The crowd had grown completely silent now, as if collectively holding their breath. Even the usual distant sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was pausing to witness what was about to unfold. The morning sun caught the brass buttons of Harrison's uniform, casting small circles of light that danced across Emily's delighted face. In that moment, Guard James Harrison did something he hadn't done in 15 years of service. He moved. The movement was deliberate, precise, every bit as measured as his ceremonial stillness had been. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as he turned, his boots pivoting with military precision to face Emily directly. Her eyes widened with surprise and wonder, her small hand instinctively reaching for her father's, but Harrison wasn't finished. With the same precision he'd learned in military training, he lowered himself to one knee, bringing himself to eye level with the brave little girl who had touched something deep within his soldier's heart. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that only years of service can create. "I couldn't help but notice how perfectly you've been standing at attention." Emily's face lit up with a joy that seemed to push back the shadows of her illness, if only for a moment. You can talk," she whispered in amazement, then quickly added with endearing formality, "Sir." Harrison's white-gloved hand moved to his chest, carefully unpinning one of his medals. "This," he said, holding it out to her, "is for exceptional bravery in the face of difficult conditions." His voice carried the same gravity he'd used in formal military ceremonies. "Something you know quite a bit about, I believe." Emily's mother had covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming freely down her face. Her father's camera shook slightly as he continued to record the moment, his own eyes glistening. Around them, several tourists had also begun to cry openly, while others smiled through their tears. "May I?" Harrison asked, waiting for Emily's small nod before carefully pinning the medal to her dress. "There, now you're officially part of the Guard." Emily touched the medal with trembling fingers, her face a picture of pure wonder. But don't you need it?" she asked, showing concern even in her moment of joy. Harrison smiled, the first time many had ever seen such an expression on a Queen's Guard's face. "I think you've earned it more than I have." He straightened his posture, still on one knee. "Would you like to learn the official salute?" For the next few moments, the crowd watched in emotional silence as Harrison guided Emily's small hand through the proper motion, her face a study in concentration despite her obvious fatigue. When she finally executed a perfect salute, a spontaneous round of applause broke out among the onlookers. "Excellent form," Harrison said, his voice carrying both military crispness and gentle warmth. Then, in a move that drew another gasp from the crowd, he opened his arms. "Would you do me the honor?" Emily didn't hesitate. She stepped forward into his embrace, her small arms barely reaching around his broad uniform. In that moment, he wasn't just a guard, and she wasn't just a sick child. They were two warriors recognizing each other's battles. When they finally parted, Emily's eyes were shining brighter than the medal on her dress. Harrison stood to his full height and executed a formal salute, not the kind given to tourists for photos, but the genuine article, the kind reserved for fellow soldiers and dignitaries of the highest rank. "Thank you," Emily's mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means." "Thank you, sir," her father added, his hand gentle on Emily's shoulder. This is more than we ever." Harrison gave them a small nod of understanding. Some moments needed no words. He turned back to Emily, who was still beaming despite the obvious fatigue beginning to show on her face. "Remember," he said with quiet authority, "you're one of us now. Stand tall." "Yes, sir," Emily replied, straightening her back despite her weariness, her small hand rising in one final perfect salute. With the same precision that had marked his every movement, Harrison returned to his post. His boots clicked together, his rifle settled back into position, and his eyes fixed forward with ceremonial sharpness. But now, there was something different, something that every witness to the scene could sense. The guard stood not just as a symbol of tradition and duty, but as a reminder that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in knowing when to break protocol for the sake of humanity. As Emily and her parents made their way back through the crowd, tourists parted respectfully, many reaching out to touch her shoulder or offer quiet words of encouragement. The metal gleamed on her pink dress, catching the late morning sun, a permanent reminder that courage comes in many forms, and true guardians protect more than just palaces. The world keeps turning, duty continues, and the guard stands watch. But for one moment on this ordinary morning, something extraordinary happened at Buckingham Palace. A guardian of tradition and a young warrior fighting her own battle reminded everyone present that while protocol serves a purpose, it's the heart that truly guides us in our finest moments. What would you have done in Guard Harrison's position? When is it right to break with tradition for the sake of compassion? If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and subscribe to Guard's Moments for more incredible tales of the Royal Guard. Don't forget to press the bell icon so you never miss an upload.